March 1943. RAF Bassingbourn, England. Dawn light filtered through the morning mist as a jeep approached the hardstand where a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress sat waiting, its aluminum skin beaded with condensation. Two armed guards flanked an ordnance technician carrying a canvas-wrapped object no larger than a suitcase. Inside that canvas was what the United States Army Air Forces called the most closely guarded secret of the war, more sensitive than radar, more protected than the Manhattan Project in its early days, a device that bombardiers swore an oath to defend with their lives, the Norden Bombsight. Second Lieutenant James Parker, bombardier of the B-17F Memphis Belle, stood at the base of his aircraft, watching the procession approach. At 22 years old, he had already memorized the oath he took during training at Midland Army Air Field in Texas. The words still echoed in his mind. Mindful of the secret trust about to be placed in me by my commander-in-chief, I do hereby, in the presence of Almighty God, swear by the Bombardier's code of honor to keep inviolate the secrecy of any and all confidential information revealed to me, and further to uphold the honor and integrity of the Army Air Forces, if need be, with my life itself. The bombardier's oath was not ceremonial rhetoric. It carried the weight of military law and the burden of genuine consequence. Every bombardier who trained on the Norden understood that if his aircraft went down over enemy territory, his final duty before capture or death was to destroy the bomb site. Thermite grenades were provided for this specific purpose. Pull the pin, place it against the mechanism, and reduce 20,000 precision machined parts to molten slag. The manual was explicit. The Norden must never fall into enemy hands intact. What Parker and tens of thousands of other American bombardiers did not know, what intelligence officers carefully avoided mentioning, was that this theatrical security protocol protected a secret that no longer existed. The complete technical specifications of the Norden bombsight had been in German hands since 1938, more than 3 years before the United States entered the war. The plans had been studied, analyzed, and dismissed by German engineers who concluded their own bombsight was superior. Every oath, every armed guard, every vault with climate control and armed sentries protected not a secret but a legend. The Norden Mark XV bombsight that Parker installed in the plexiglass nose of his B-17 represented the culmination of 2 decades of development. Carl Norden, a Dutch engineer who immigrated to America, had begun work on the device in 1921. His vision was revolutionary: create a mechanical computer that could calculate in real time the complex physics of dropping a bomb from a moving aircraft at high altitude, accounting for wind speed, wind direction, aircraft velocity, altitude, air temperature, and the ballistic characteristics of the bomb itself. The result was a technological marvel. The Norden consisted of 2 primary assemblies: a gyroscopically stabilized optical sight and an analog computer that continuously recalculated impact point based on changing flight conditions. The stabilizer used gyroscopes spinning at 18,000 revolutions per minute, creating a platform that remained level regardless of aircraft movement. The bombardier could look through the telescope and see the target as if he were standing on solid ground, not flying through turbulent air at 200 miles per hour. The analog computer was even more impressive. Using a complex arrangement of gears, cams, and mechanical integrators, it solved differential equations in real time. As the bombardier tracked the target, the computer measured the angular velocity, calculated ground speed, compensated for wind drift, determined trail angle, and computed the precise moment for bomb release. The entire system could even control the aircraft's autopilot during the bomb run, making corrections too subtle and rapid for human pilots to execute. In pre-war testing conditions at Muroc Dry Lake in California, the Norden demonstrated astonishing accuracy. Bombardiers dropping practice bombs from 20,000 feet achieved a circular error probable of 75 feet. This meant that half of all bombs fell within a 75-foot radius of the aim point. At 25,000 feet, the accuracy degraded slightly, but remained remarkable by any contemporary standard. The Air Corps publicity machine seized on these numbers and amplified them into legend. The claim that emerged, repeated in newspapers and newsreels, was that the Norden could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The pickle barrel claim was marketing hyperbole, but it served a strategic purpose. If America's enemies believed the United States possessed bomb sights of supernatural accuracy, perhaps they would think twice about provoking war. If they did go to war, perhaps they would waste resources trying to defend every factory, every rail yard, every bridge, believing all were equally vulnerable to precision destruction from the stratosphere. Security protocols surrounding the Norden reinforced this psychological warfare. Bomb sights were stored in temperature-controlled vaults. Access required dual authorization. Guards maintained 24-hour watches. During training flights, bombardiers covered the device with canvas shrouds. When aircraft deployed overseas, the bomb sights traveled separately under armed escort. The message was clear. This device was so valuable, so revolutionary, that its compromise would alter the balance of the war. What no one mentioned to Parker as he signed for the Norden and carried it up into the nose of his B-17 was that German engineers had examined these same mechanisms 5 years earlier. They had studied the gyroscopes, analyzed the computer, tested the calculations, and reached a conclusion that would have shocked American military planners. The Norden was impressive, certainly. It was sophisticated, undoubtedly, but it was not superior to what Germany already possessed. In fact, German engineers found it overcomplicated, difficult to maintain, and unnecessarily fragile for combat conditions. The story of how Germany obtained the Norden secrets, what they discovered when they examined it, and why that knowledge ultimately failed to prevent American strategic bombing from devastating the Reich, reveals a deeper truth about industrial warfare. Technical specifications matter less than industrial capacity. Knowing your enemy's weapons does not guarantee victory. Understanding how a thing works is not the same as possessing the infrastructure, resources, and strategic vision to counter it effectively. Parker settled into the bombardier's position, his knees on the padded rests, his face pressed against the eyepiece of the Norden. Outside, the ground crew disconnected auxiliary power. Engines coughed to life one by one, 4 Wright Cyclone radials building to a synchronized roar. Around Bassingbourn, dozens of other B-17s were waking up, preparing for another maximum effort against targets deep in Germany. The bombardiers in each aircraft believed they carried America's secret weapon. They had no idea that the secret had been betrayed before the war even began, or that the weapon's true power lay not in its precision, but in the fact that America could build them by the thousand while training tens of thousands of men to operate them under conditions of unimaginable stress and violence. Hermann W. Lang did not look like a spy. At 40 years old, he was an unremarkable man of medium height and thinning hair, with the calloused hands of a skilled machinist and the patient disposition of a craftsman who had spent 2 decades perfecting his trade. He lived in a modest house in Ridgewood, Queens, with his wife and children. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, hard-working immigrant who had come to America from Germany in 1927, part of the wave of technical workers seeking opportunity in the booming American economy. What his neighbors did not know was that Lang's emigration had not been voluntary, and his past was considerably darker than his present suggested. In 1923, Hermann Lang had been a young Nazi stormtrooper participating in Adolf Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in Munich. When the coup collapsed and Hitler was imprisoned, Lang fled Germany to avoid prosecution. He made his way to the United States, where he found work in New York's industrial sector. His engineering skills and meticulous attention to detail earned him steady employment. By 1929, he had secured a position at the Carl L. Norden Corporation in Manhattan, a small company producing precision optical instruments and, increasingly, classified military equipment. Lang's job was assembly inspector and draftsman, responsible for checking components and maintaining technical drawings. It was detail-oriented work that required access to classified designs. As the Norden Bombsight moved from prototype to production, Lang found himself with overnight access to the most closely guarded technical drawings in American military aviation. He was trusted. He was thorough. He asked intelligent questions. No one suspected that each night, after his colleagues departed, Lang was photographically memorizing specifications and hand-copying blueprints at his kitchen table while his family slept. The year 1937 marked Lang's reactivation as an agent of the Third Reich. A man named Nikolaus Ritter, an Oberst in the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, made contact through intermediaries. Ritter, operating under diplomatic cover, ran a network of agents throughout the United States focused on acquiring American military technology. He had a specific shopping list, and near the top was information about the American bombsight that rumors suggested could revolutionize high-altitude bombing. Lang required little persuasion. His Nazi sympathies had never wavered during his American exile. He saw his cooperation not as treason against his adopted country, but as patriotic service to his true homeland. In October 1937, he met Ritter personally and explained that he had access to the complete technical drawings of the Norden bombsight. Ritter was skeptical. Such access seemed too good to be true, but Lang insisted it was possible and he could prove it. Over the following months, Lang executed one of the most damaging acts of espionage in American military history. Working alone, using no specialized equipment, he systematically copied every significant technical drawing of the Norden Mark XV bombsight. He worked in his kitchen after midnight, spreading blueprints across the table, copying dimensions and specifications by hand. His engineering training made the work relatively straightforward. He understood what he was looking at, knew which details mattered, could identify critical tolerances and key mechanisms. The challenge was delivery. Lang could not simply mail the drawings to Germany. Security at Norden was being tightened as military contracts expanded. Any suspicious activity would trigger investigation. The solution required patience and theatrical misdirection. Lang rolled his copied blueprints tightly and concealed them inside a hollowed-out wooden umbrella handle. The modification was professional, invisible to casual inspection. An umbrella was an entirely reasonable possession for a New Yorker. No one would look twice. On January 9, 1938, Lang carried his umbrella to the New York waterfront. The SS Reliance, a passenger liner bound for Bremen, was preparing to depart. Among the crew was a German steward who doubled as a courier for the Abwehr. The handoff was casual, unremarkable. Lang boarded briefly under the pretense of seeing off a friend, left his umbrella in a prearranged location, and departed. The steward collected it after the ship cleared New York Harbor. 10 days later, the blueprints of America's most secret weapon arrived in Germany. For his efforts, Lang received $1,500, roughly $28,000 in today's currency. But Ritter was not satisfied with blueprints alone. Paper specifications, no matter how detailed, could not replace hands-on examination. There were questions about materials, manufacturing tolerances, assembly procedures, and operational techniques that drawings could not fully answer. Ritter wanted Lang in Germany, physically present, to assist in building a working prototype. In summer 1938, Lang took a vacation to Germany. To his American employers and neighbors, it was a nostalgic trip to visit relatives. In reality, Lang spent several weeks at a secure Luftwaffe facility working with German engineers and technicians. He supervised the construction of a full-scale mock-up of the Norden bombsight based on his stolen drawings, explaining assembly procedures, clarifying ambiguous specifications, and demonstrating operational techniques. His expertise was invaluable. By the time he returned to the United States in August, German military intelligence possessed both the complete technical documentation and a functioning reconstruction of America's premier bombsight. For his extended consultation, Lang received 10,000 Reichsmarks, equivalent to approximately $40,000 in contemporary value. He returned to his job at Norden, resumed his quiet life in Queens, and waited. His work was complete. What Germany did with the information was now beyond his control. Lang's espionage remained undetected until 1941, and only then through pure accident. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been monitoring a separate Abwehr network operating in New York, eventually identified as the Duquesne spy ring. One of the agents in that network, William Sebold, was actually a double agent working for the FBI. Through Sebold's reports and surveillance of other network members, investigators identified Lang and connected him to the Norden security breach. By the time of Lang's arrest in June 1941, the damage was long complete. The Nazis had possessed the Norden secrets for 3 years. They had built prototypes, conducted tests, and made strategic decisions based on comprehensive understanding of American bombsight technology. When FBI agents confronted Lang at his home, he initially denied everything. Only when presented with overwhelming evidence did he admit his actions, though he refused to express remorse. He had, he insisted, acted in service to Germany, his true homeland. At trial, Lang's defense argued he had acted on patriotic impulse, not for financial gain. The argument failed to impress the jury. In January 1942, Hermann Lang was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. He served 8 years before being paroled and deported to Germany in September 1950, where he disappeared into post-war obscurity. By then, the Norden bombsight was obsolete, replaced by radar-guided systems. The secret Lang had stolen no longer mattered. But in 1938, when those blueprints arrived in Berlin, they represented a potential strategic advantage for German military planners. The question was what they would do with that knowledge. Would they copy the American design, modify it, abandon their own bombsight development in favor of the American approach? The answers would reveal fundamental differences in engineering philosophy between American and German military industries. The package from New York arrived at Abwehr headquarters in Berlin on a gray January morning in 1938. Oberst Nikolaus Ritter personally supervised its opening in a secure conference room. Present were 3 senior engineers from Carl Zeiss, Germany's premier optical manufacturer and primary contractor for Luftwaffe bombsight development, along with representatives from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry. What they extracted from that hollowed umbrella handle were dozens of hand-copied technical drawings representing years of American research and hundreds of thousands of dollars in development costs, delivered for the price of a transatlantic ticket and a modest cash payment. The initial reaction was professional skepticism. Intelligence coups that appear too good to be true usually are. The drawings could be disinformation, deliberately leaked to misdirect German research down unproductive paths. They could be outdated specifications for an earlier prototype, useless for understanding current American capabilities. They could be legitimate but incomplete, missing critical details that would only become apparent when engineers attempted construction. Verification would require detailed analysis by experts who understood both bombsight technology and American manufacturing practices. The Carl Zeiss engineers spread the drawings across a large table and began systematic examination. The first assessment was encouraging. These were legitimate technical specifications, not crude sketches or propaganda fabrications. The drawings showed consistent drafting standards, appropriate use of engineering notation, realistic tolerances for precision manufacturing, and internal consistency across multiple documents. Whoever had copied these understood technical drawing conventions and had access to authentic source material. What emerged from initial analysis was a picture of a sophisticated but complex device. The American bombsight consisted of two major assemblies linked by electrical connections and mechanical coupling. The stabilizer assembly used a gyroscopic platform to create a level reference independent of aircraft motion. The sight head contained the optical telescope, analog computer, and control interfaces. Together, these components weighed approximately 50 pounds and required careful calibration before each mission. The gyroscopic stabilizer impressed the German engineers immediately. It used two gyroscopes arranged perpendicular to each other, creating a stable platform in two axes. The gyros spun at 18,000 revolutions per minute, powered by a dedicated electrical motor. The entire assembly was suspended in a gimbal mount that isolated it from aircraft vibration and maneuver loads. This was elegant engineering, solving the fundamental problem of aiming accurately from an unstable platform. The analog computer was even more sophisticated. Using an intricate arrangement of gears, cams, differentials, and mechanical integrators, it continuously solved the bombing equation, calculating the ground track, determining range to target, computing release angle, and accounting for wind drift. The bombardier inputs were surprisingly simple: altitude, airspeed, wind velocity. But the internal mechanisms translated these into precise output, the exact moment to release ordnance for maximum probability of hit. What particularly interested the German engineers was the autopilot integration. The American design allowed the bombsight to directly control the aircraft during the bomb run. The bombardier, looking through his telescope, would make small corrections to keep the target centered. These inputs fed through the computer to the autopilot, which adjusted the aircraft's heading with precision impossible for human pilots. This closed-loop system promised unprecedented accuracy by eliminating human reaction time from the aiming process. Over several weeks, the Carl Zeiss team worked through the drawings, identifying critical components, noting manufacturing challenges, and comparing the American design philosophy with their own. They prepared a comprehensive technical assessment for Luftwaffe leadership, but they also prepared something more important: a comparative analysis. How did the Norden stack up against Germany's own bombsight development, particularly the Lotfernrohr series that Carl Zeiss had been refining since the early 1930s? The assessment, completed in March 1938, reached conclusions that would prove strategically significant. Yes, the American Norden bombsight was impressive. Its accuracy in ideal conditions was probably superior to anything Germany currently fielded. The gyroscopic stabilization was more sophisticated than German equivalents. The autopilot integration was innovative and potentially valuable. But, and this was the critical judgment, the American design was overcomplicated for operational conditions, difficult to manufacture in quantity, challenging to maintain in field conditions, and required extensive training for effective use. German engineers noted that the Norden consisted of approximately 20,000 individual parts, many requiring precision machining to tight tolerances. The gyroscopic assembly alone demanded manufacturing capabilities that only a few German facilities possessed. The analog computer required skilled assembly and careful calibration. The entire system was sensitive to temperature variations, vibration, and rough handling. In combat conditions, reliability would likely suffer. Moreover, the training requirements appeared formidable. American bombardiers, according to captured training manuals that Abwehr had also acquired, underwent months of specialized instruction. They learned not just how to operate the bombsight but how to diagnose malfunctions, perform field calibration, and compensate for various failure modes. This level of training investment was possible for a wealthy nation building a small professional air force, but problematic for Germany, which anticipated rapid expansion and mass mobilization if war came. In April 1938, a demonstration was arranged at Richlin, the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility. German engineers had constructed a partial mock-up of the Norden using the stolen specifications, lacking only certain proprietary components they could not manufacture without additional information. This mock-up was presented to senior Luftwaffe officers, including Generalfeldmarschall Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and one of Hitler's closest confidants. Göring's reaction was characteristically bombastic. He praised Abwehr's intelligence coup, commended the engineers' rapid reconstruction, and declared that Germany now possessed insight into American military technology that would prove valuable in any future conflict. But when asked whether the Luftwaffe should adopt the American design, Göring deferred to his technical advisors. The consensus was clear: continue with indigenous development. The reasoning was both technical and strategic. Germany's Lotfernrohr series, particularly the newer models under development, offered comparable accuracy with simpler construction, easier maintenance, and faster training pipelines. The Lot 7, then in advanced development, used similar gyroscopic principles but integrated the stabilizer and sight head into a single compact unit. Where the Norden required the bombardier to manage two separate assemblies with multiple adjustment points, the Lot 7 presented a streamlined interface with three primary control knobs. More importantly, the German design philosophy prioritized reliability over ultimate precision. Luftwaffe planners anticipated that their bombers would operate in contested airspace, subject to fighter attack and anti-aircraft fire. Bombardiers would be performing under extreme stress, possibly wounded, definitely distracted by defensive concerns. In such conditions, a simpler bombsight that could be operated effectively by a moderately trained bombardier was preferable to a more sophisticated system that demanded perfect conditions and expert operation for optimal performance. There was also the industrial consideration. Germany's rearmament program was already straining manufacturing capacity. Adding production of a complex American-designed bombsight would require dedicating precision manufacturing facilities, training specialized workers, and diverting resources from other programs. The cost-benefit analysis favored continued development of indigenous designs that German industry was already tooled to produce. The final report to Göring concluded with recommendations that shaped German bombsight strategy for the remainder of the war. First, continued development and deployment of the Lotfernrohr series, incorporating any useful concepts from the American design. Second, maintain intelligence focus on American aviation technology, as their engineering approaches offered valuable insights. Third, recognize that American precision bombing doctrine relied on technical sophistication that Germany should exploit through disruption. Damage the bombsights, kill the trained bombardiers, force bombers to operate in conditions where precision equipment became ineffective. What German intelligence had not fully grasped, what they would only discover years later when American bombers appeared over Germany in massive formations, was that technical specifications told only part of the story. The real secret of American air power was not the design of the Norden bombsight, but the industrial system that could manufacture thousands of them, the training apparatus that could produce tens of thousands of qualified bombardiers, and the strategic vision that conceived of daylight precision bombing as a sustainable doctrine rather than a theoretical aspiration. By mid-1938, the Norden bombsight plans were filed away at Richlin and Carl Zeiss facilities, available for reference but no longer actively studied. German engineers had learned what they needed to know. American bombsight technology was sophisticated but not superior enough to justify imitation. The Luftwaffe would proceed with its own designs, confident that German engineering was adequate to the task. What they could not foresee was that adequate would prove insufficient when facing an enemy who could afford to be extravagant, who could waste bombs on near misses, because factories could produce unlimited replacement ordnance, who could accept mediocre accuracy from individual bombardiers, because hundreds of bombers striking simultaneously, would achieve through mass what could not be reliably achieved through precision. 25,000 feet above the Earth, the atmosphere thins to approximately one-third sea level pressure. Temperature drops to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen levels are insufficient to sustain consciousness. At this altitude, humans require pressurized cabins or oxygen masks merely to survive, let alone perform complex technical tasks. Yet this hostile environment was precisely where American strategic bombing doctrine demanded that bombardiers perform one of the most difficult tasks in aerial warfare. Visually acquire a target the size of a factory building, track it through a bomb site while the aircraft flew at 200 miles per hour, compensate for wind drift that could push bombs hundreds of feet off course, and calculate the precise moment to release ordnance so that it would fall true despite traveling through 5 miles of increasingly dense atmosphere. The physics of the problem were daunting. A 500-pound general-purpose bomb released from 25,000 feet would fall for approximately 30 seconds before impact, traveling not vertically but in a complex ballistic arc influenced by wind, air density, temperature gradients, the bomb's aerodynamic characteristics, and the forward velocity imparted by the aircraft's motion. The bomb did not fall from directly above the target, but had to be released while the aircraft was still thousands of feet away horizontally, requiring the bombardier to aim at empty air and trust the mathematics to bring bomb and target together. Consider the complexity. The B-17 Flying Fortress bombing at 25,000 feet has a true airspeed of approximately 223 miles per hour, or 327 feet per second. At the moment of bomb release, the bomb possesses this same forward velocity. As it falls, aerodynamic drag reduces the horizontal velocity while gravity accelerates the vertical component. The bomb traces a parabolic path through the atmosphere, but that atmosphere is not uniform. Wind at 25,000 feet might blow at 60 miles per hour from the west, while wind at 10,000 feet might be only 30 miles per hour from the northwest. These differential wind velocities push the bomb laterally during its descent, creating drift that must be calculated and compensated. Temperature affects air density, which affects both bomb ballistics and the accuracy of airspeed indicators. A bombardier using indicated airspeed instead of true airspeed would miscalculate ground speed, leading to aiming errors. The bomb's ballistic coefficient, its ability to overcome air resistance, varied with manufacturing tolerances. No two bombs fell exactly the same way. Even the act of releasing bombs from a moving aircraft introduced variables. Did the bomb separate cleanly, or did it tumble? Did wind buffeting from adjacent bombs alter its trajectory? The Norden Bombsight was designed to solve this multidimensional calculus problem in real time, using purely mechanical computation. At its heart was an analog computer built from gears, cams, differentials, and mechanical integrators, devices that could perform continuous integration and differentiation through physical motion of precisely machined components. The computer accepted inputs for altitude, airspeed, bomb ballistic coefficient, wind velocity, and wind direction, then calculated the release angle, the angle between the aircraft's ground track and the line from aircraft to target at the moment of bomb release. The gyroscopic stabilizer was the foundation of accuracy. 2 gyroscopes, each spinning at 18,000 revolutions per minute, created a platform that remained level relative to the Earth's surface regardless of aircraft motion. The bombardier's telescope was mounted on this stable platform, providing a view that compensated for pitch, roll, and yaw. When the pilot banked the aircraft, the view through the Norden remained steady. This stability was essential for accurate sighting, and for the tachometric measurement system, that was the Norden's key innovation. The tachometric or synchronous method was the Norden's defining feature, distinguishing it from earlier bombsight designs. Rather than setting a fixed aiming angle and releasing bombs when the target passed through the crosshairs, the Norden worked by rate measurement. The bombardier would locate the target well before the drop point, sometimes several minutes in advance. Using a control called the rate motor, he would adjust a rotating prism in the optical path so that the target appeared stationary in the telescope despite the aircraft's forward motion. This adjustment directly measured the angular velocity of the target as seen from the aircraft. The analog computer used this rate information, combined with altitude data, to calculate ground speed with high precision. Ground speed was the critical variable that earlier bomb sites could only estimate, but the Norden measured it directly through the tachometric method. Once ground speed was known, the computer could calculate the exact trail angle and release point. The autopilot integration added another layer of capability. During the bomb run, typically the final 60 to 90 seconds before release, the bombardier could engage the automatic flight control equipment, universally known as AFCE. This system linked the bombsight directly to the aircraft's autopilot. Small adjustments the bombardier made to keep the target centered in the telescope were translated into heading corrections that the autopilot executed. The aircraft essentially flew itself toward the release point under guidance from the bombsight, with the bombardier acting as a precision control. In theory, in ideal conditions, with perfect inputs and expert operation, the Norden system could achieve extraordinary accuracy. The pre-war testing at Muroc, Dry Lake in California demonstrated circular error probable of 75 feet from 20,000 feet. This meant that half of all bombs fell within a 75-foot radius of the aim point. At 25,000 feet, test accuracy degraded to approximately 120 feet SEP under perfect conditions, clear visibility, no defensive fire, no evasive maneuvering, light winds, experienced bombardier, properly calibrated equipment. But combat conditions were never ideal. The reality of bombing missions over Europe introduced variables that the Norden's mechanical computer could not fully account for and operational procedures could not eliminate. The first problem was formation flying. American strategic doctrine emphasized mass formation bombing for defensive purposes. Individual B-17s were vulnerable to fighter attack, but formations of dozens or hundreds of bombers created interlocking fields of defensive fire that made German fighter approaches costly and dangerous. However, formation flying meant that only the lead bombardier actually used his Norden to aim. All other bombardiers in the formation watched the lead aircraft and released their bombs simultaneously when they saw the lead's ordnance drop. This technique, called pattern bombing, sacrificed individual accuracy for the defensive benefits of formation integrity. If the lead bombardier was off target by 200 feet, every aircraft in the formation was off by the same amount, plus additional dispersion from variations in release timing and bomb ballistics. Weather was an even more significant problem. Strategic bombing required visual acquisition of the target. If clouds obscured the aim point, the Norden was useless. Over northern Europe, cloud cover was common year-round and nearly constant during winter months. Missions were regularly aborted because targets were obscured. When breaks in clouds appeared, bombardiers had only seconds to acquire the target, set up the sight, and complete the bomb run. The careful, methodical procedures perfected in training became frantic improvisations. Enemy action introduced the most severe disruptions. German flak, anti-aircraft artillery, was devastatingly effective over defended targets. The bomb run, when the aircraft flew straight and level to allow the bombardier to track the target, was when B-17s were most vulnerable. Black clouds of exploding 88mm shells surrounded the formations, each burst capable of shredding aluminum skin and destroying engines, severing control cables, killing crew members. The concussion from near misses threw aircraft off course. The psychological effect on bombardiers trying to perform delicate technical operations while shrapnel penetrated around them was immense. German fighter attacks added another dimension of chaos. Luftwaffe pilots learned to time their attacks for the bomb run, knowing that bomber formations maintained steady courses during this critical phase. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s would make high-speed passes through the formations, 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns firing. The defensive machine guns of the bombers would return fire, tracers streaking in all directions, shell casings filling the aircraft, cordite smoke obscuring visibility. Bombardiers trying to peer through their Norden telescopes were distracted by the violence erupting around them. Even without enemy interference, the operational environment at 25,000 feet tested equipment and human performance. The temperature inside B-17s was typically 30 to 40 degrees below zero. Men wore electrically heated suits that frequently malfunctioned. Frostbite was common. Oxygen systems were essential but temperamental. Hypoxia from oxygen system failure could impair judgment and motor control without the victim realizing it. Several instances of bombing errors were later attributed to bombardiers experiencing mild hypoxia that affected their ability to operate the Norden correctly. The bombsight itself suffered reliability problems in field conditions. The Norden required careful pre-flight calibration and was sensitive to temperature extremes. Gyroscopes occasionally failed mid-mission. Electrical motors driving the rate mechanism burned out. The complex gearing could bind if lubricants thickened in the cold. Bomb groups reported that significant percentages of Norden sites required maintenance after each mission, with some suffering permanent damage from flak or rough landings. Yet despite these limitations, the Norden represented a genuine advance in bombing technology. Its tachometric method for measuring ground speed was superior to estimation techniques used in earlier bomb sites. The gyroscopic stabilization did provide a steadier platform. The autopilot integration, when conditions permitted its use, did improve accuracy. Where the Norden fell short was not in its engineering, but in the gap between theoretical performance under ideal conditions and actual performance under combat conditions. The Germans, examining captured Nordens from shot-down B-17s, understood this gap. They recognized the sophistication of the design. They appreciated the engineering challenges that had been overcome in creating a functional mechanical computer. But they also saw the vulnerability of the system to the very conditions that combat imposed. The Norden was optimized for precision, but war favored reliability. It was designed for expert operators working methodically, but combat demanded performance from frightened men working under extreme stress. August 17, 1942. RAF Grafton Underwood, England. 12 Boeing B-17E Flying Fortresses of the 97th Bomb Group prepared for takeoff, their Wright Cyclone engines warming under gray skis. This was the first operational mission flown by the United States Army Air Force's heavy bombers against targets in occupied Europe, a moment that military planners hoped would validate years of doctrine development and billions of dollars in procurement spending. The target was Rouen-Sotteville, a marshalling yard in northern France where German trains concentrated before moving supplies to the Channel coast. It was, by strategic bombing standards, a modest objective, but it was a beginning. The mission plan reflected cautious optimism. 12 aircraft represented a token force, barely enough to test operational procedures but insufficient to gauge the true capability of strategic bombardment. The target was relatively close to England, minimizing exposure to German defenses. Fighter escort would accompany the bombers throughout the mission, something that deeper penetrations into Germany could not yet achieve. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies over the target, eliminating the complications that clouds would introduce. If precision bombing was to receive a favorable debut, conditions needed to be optimal. Each carried a bombardier who had completed months of Norden training. These were the first American combat bombardiers to operate over Europe, and they represented the cutting edge of the bomber mafia's ambitions. They had practiced bombing runs until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. They had memorized the procedures for every conceivable malfunction. They had absorbed the mythology of the Norden, that they possessed an instrument of such precision that they could select targets with surgical accuracy, that their bombing campaign would win wars without requiring massive ground armies, that technology could substitute for the grinding mud-and-blood attrition that characterized warfare on land. At 15:39 hours, the first B-17 lifted off, engines straining against the weight of fuel and ordnance. One by one, 12 bombers climbed through the haze. Brigadier General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Bomber Command, rode in the lead aircraft named Yankee Doodle as it formed up with the other bombers. The diversionary force of 6 additional B-17s was tasked with attracting fighter attention along the French coast, while the main force pressed inland toward Rouen. For over 3 hours, the tension at Grafton Underwood was nearly unbearable. Ground crews, mechanics, and support staff gathered at the control tower, waiting for the first indication that the bombers had completed their mission and were beginning the return flight. Newspapermen, photographers, and war correspondents stood among the assembled crowd, sensing that history was being made. This was the moment that would justify all the investment, all the doctrine development, all the confident assertions that American technical superiority could win wars from the air. At 1800 hours, lookouts spotted specks to the west. As the aircraft grew closer, the count confirmed, all 12 bombers were returning. At exactly 1900 hours, the first B-17 touched down on the runway. The others followed at brief intervals, engines throttled back, gear extended, pilots executing landings that had become routine through hundreds of practice approaches. But nothing about this moment was routine. Pilots and crews descended from their aircraft into scenes of jubilation mixed with professional assessment. Mission reports were transmitted to higher commands. Reconnaissance photographs were rushed to analysis centers. The initial reports from bombardiers were encouraging. They reported dropping their ordnance on or near the target. No battle casualties had been sustained. The flak had been moderate and mostly inaccurate. A small number of German fighters had made tentative attacks, but had been driven off by the defensive armament of the bombers and the protective Spitfire cover. From an altitude of 23,000 feet, the 12 B-17s had dropped a combined load of 36,900 pounds of bombs on the Rouen-Sotteville marshalling yard. Approximately half of the bombs fell in the general target area, which for a first mission of this type was considered surprisingly accurate. One aiming point, the locomotive workshops, received a direct hit. Several bombs burst within 1,500 feet of the target point. The bombs intended for the second aiming point, the Buddicombe rolling stock repair shops, fell mostly about 2,000 feet to the south. But the large size of the marshalling yard meant that even technically inaccurate bombing still achieved effects. The initial post-mission analysis was cautiously optimistic. 2 large transshipment sheds in the center of the marshalling yard were destroyed by direct hits. Approximately 10 of the 24 tracks on the sidings were damaged. Rolling stock was destroyed or derailed. The locomotive workshop received damage that would slow the movement of locomotives and rolling stock through the yard. It was not the knockout blow that some advocates had imagined precision bombing could deliver, but it was undeniably effective damage inflicted on the German war economy by the first American heavy bombers to strike German-occupied Europe. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, the mission had achieved what doctrine demanded. It had demonstrated that B-17s operating from England could penetrate to targets in occupied Europe, deliver tonnage with acceptable accuracy using the Norden Bombsight, defend themselves adequately against opposition, and return to their bases with minimal casualties. All 12 bombers returned. Of 2 that sustained damage, both had made it back to England. The only casualties reported were minor. shrapnel wounds to 2 bombardiers from anti-aircraft fire, and curiously, one crew member who had been slightly injured when the aircraft hit a pigeon during the return flight, and shattered glass from the nose turret had lacerated his face. Within 24 hours, the Rouen mission had transformed the strategic situation, where previously there had been skepticism in some British quarters about the viability of American daylight bombing doctrine. Now there was measured enthusiasm. The evidence was concrete. American bombardiers with Norden sights had demonstrated they could find targets across the English Channel, locate aim points, and deliver ordnance with adequate precision. General Ira Eaker, in his post-mission report, emphasized the accuracy of the bombing and its consistency with American doctrine assertions. General Carl Zeiss, commanding the 8th Air Force, sent a terse cable to headquarters. The attack on Rouen had exceeded in accuracy any previous high-altitude bombing in the European theater by German or Allied aircraft, and the results justified American belief in the feasibility of daylight bombing. For German observers monitoring the raid, the implications were immediately apparent. A B-17 had been forced down by flak and captured, complete with the body of a dead bombardier still in the nose turret. An examination of this wreckage was ordered. German aircraft had intercepted a formation of American bombers, had attacked it repeatedly, and had failed to cause significant casualties or damage. This was not a battle lost. It was merely a first engagement, but it represented a troubling performance by the Luftwaffe. If American bombers could operate over France with such apparent immunity, what would happen when they attempted to penetrate deeper into German airspace? The confidence in Rouen was not entirely justified by the results. The raid had occurred under nearly ideal conditions: clear skies, short range, strong fighter escort, negligible opposition. Future missions would find Germany willing to allocate greater defensive resources. But for the moment, the 8th Air Force had demonstrated proof of concept. The Norden Bombsight, operated by trained American bombardiers, had proven effective in combat conditions. Now the question was whether this first success could be repeated and expanded into a sustained strategic bombing campaign. October 1943. A Luftwaffe repair facility near Bremen. German technicians carefully placed the pieces of an American B-17 on heavy wooden tables, assembling the wreckage like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. The aircraft had been shot down 3 weeks earlier during a raid on Bremen itself, a victim of flak and fighters over its target. The fuselage had been salvaged and transported to this facility, specifically because it contained something the German Air Ministry wanted examined: a Norden Bombsight, remarkably intact despite the violence of the shoot-down and the bomber's final impact with the ground. This was not the first captured Norden to arrive in German hands. Throughout 1943, as American strategic bombing expanded and losses mounted, additional examples had been recovered from crashed B-17s. But each intact specimen was treated as a prize worthy of detailed technical examination. German intelligence wanted to understand not just the theoretical operation of the Norden, but its actual condition after combat, its battle damage patterns, the wear on its mechanical components, the degradation of its precision mechanisms under operational stress. The examination of this particular Norden was assigned to a team of senior engineers from Zeiss and the Luftwaffe Technical Bureau. They approached the task with professional thoroughness, documenting every detail with photographs and technical drawings. What they discovered confirmed what they had learned from the original stolen blueprints 5 years earlier. The Norden was indeed a sophisticated device, its mechanical computer representing genuine engineering achievement, its gyroscopic stabilization system far more elaborate than anything Germany had adopted for its own bomb sites. But the examination also revealed troubling truths about the system's operational characteristics. The bomb site showed signs of mechanical stress far exceeding the nominal service life assumed during peacetime. Several components had cracked under vibration. The gyroscopic bearings showed wear and corrosion despite protective lubricants. The electrical connections displayed corrosion that would degrade signal transmission. The mechanical linkages between the stabilizer and the sight head showed misalignment that would introduce aiming errors. The German engineers noted that the captured bomb site had accumulated perhaps 100 hours of operational flight time, a fraction of its intended service life. Yet the degradation was already apparent. In a sustained air campaign involving hundreds of bombing missions, the reliability problems would become catastrophic. Bomb sites would require maintenance after every few missions. Calibration would drift despite efforts to correct it. Some percentage would fail completely, forcing bombardiers to rely on simpler backup sites or visual estimation. This assessment, while confirming German suspicions, did nothing to alter the strategic situation. The fact that the Norden possessed operational vulnerabilities did not prevent American B-17s from continuing their bombing campaign. Indeed, the captured bomb site revealed another crucial insight. The Americans were not relying on the Norden's precision alone to achieve bombing results. Formation bombing techniques, where all aircraft in a formation released simultaneously when the lead bombardier dropped his ordnance, meant that the Norden's accuracy contributed only to the placement of the leading bomb wave. Subsequent bombs in the pattern were dropped based on timing alone, with no bomb site aiming involved. The German engineers recognized that this technique was a conscious choice, not a technical limitation. American planners had apparently concluded that formation bombing's defensive advantages outweighed the sacrifice of individual bombardier accuracy. By forcing all bombers to release in formation rather than individually, the Americans accepted increased dispersion around the target in exchange for maintaining formation integrity and maximizing defensive firepower. This was the triumph of doctrine over technology, of strategic thinking over technical sophistication. Nowhere was this tactical choice more evident than in the behavior of American bombardiers during contested bomb runs. Captured bombardiers and survivors from shot-down aircraft reported that maintaining formation was more important than achieving perfect bombing accuracy. If one aircraft lagged slightly behind the formation, its bombardier would release early rather than push forward alone and break formation. If the lead bombardier's release was obscured by smoke or weather, trailing bombardiers would maintain their intervals and release based on timing calculations rather than waiting for visual confirmation. The formation was the unit of maneuver, not the individual aircraft. This realization had profound implications for German countermeasures. Instead of focusing on damaging individual Norden bomb sites, a goal that seemed increasingly impractical given their protection in the aircraft's nose, German planners shifted their emphasis to disrupting formation integrity. If bomber formations could be broken up, scattered, and forced to operate as individuals, the bombing accuracy would degrade catastrophically not because the Nordens malfunctioned, but because the tactical doctrine that had been built around formation bombing would collapse. The captured Norden also revealed the Americans' generous approach to spare parts and maintenance resources. The bomb site contained wear components that had been replaced, suggesting that the Army Air Forces operated with such abundance of resources that repair rather than replacement was almost an afterthought. Where German industry would have attempted to overhaul and rebuild captured equipment for reuse, the Americans were reported to simply install new components and return the bomb site to service. This profligacy reflected the vast industrial capacity that Germany could observe but not match. A final insight emerged from the examination. The Norden was fragile. Despite its mechanical sophistication, it was vulnerable to damage from impacts, extreme temperatures, moisture, and vibration. The delicate balance between precision and robustness had been tilted decisively toward precision. This meant that the Norden required careful handling, stable mounting, and environmental protection that might not always be available in combat aircraft, undergoing violent maneuvering and absorbing battle damage. A bombing run through heavy flak was the worst possible environment for an instrument optimized for precision. German intelligence synthesized these observations into a comprehensive assessment for the Luftwaffe High Command. The Norden Bombsight was impressive, but it was also the linchpin of American strategic bombing doctrine. If that doctrine could be disrupted, if formations could be broken and bombers forced to operate individually, then the Norden's sophistication would become a liability rather than an asset. The Americans had staked their entire bombing campaign on the assumption that precision from altitude was achievable. But that precision relied on formation bombing, which sacrificed accuracy for defense, negating the very precision that the Norden promised. The German conclusion was that the American system contained fundamental contradictions that could be exploited. Yet despite this understanding, German air defenses remained unable to prevent the bombing campaign. Why? The answer lay not in understanding the enemy's system, but in the vast resource differential between the two sides. For every Norden bombsight that failed, the Americans had replacements. For every B-17 shot down, the factories in the United States produced 5 more. For every bombardier killed or captured, training schools graduated 10 replacements. Knowledge of American vulnerabilities was worthless without the means to exploit them, and Germany's means were shrinking with each passing month of the war. 25,000 feet represented not an arbitrary altitude choice, but a carefully calculated compromise between competing demands. Higher altitude meant greater immunity from anti-aircraft fire, as most German flak installations could not effectively reach beyond 25,000 feet. The German 88mm gun, the most feared flak weapon, had a maximum theoretical altitude ceiling of approximately 36,000 feet, but effective engagement occurred only within 17 to 20,000 feet. By bombing from 25,000 feet, B-17s operated above the effective engagement envelope of most German anti-aircraft artillery, except the most modern installations. But altitude came at a cost. The higher the bombing aircraft climbed, the colder and thinner the air became. At 25,000 feet, atmospheric pressure was roughly 1/3 of sea level value. Oxygen availability was critically low. Unacclimatized humans became unconscious within minutes of exposure to such altitude. Aircraft engines, designed to function at sea-level air density, experienced significant performance degradation as the thin air reduced available oxygen for combustion. Bomb ballistics changed as air density decreased, with bombs drifting more in their descent through the thin upper atmosphere. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to operate effectively at high altitude, with turbocharged engines that compressed thin air to maintain power output, pressurized crew compartments for pilot and bombardier, and heated oxygen systems for the gunners in unheated turrets scattered throughout the fuselage. But design specifications and operational reality diverged. Turbochargers leaked, reducing their effectiveness. Oxygen systems froze at extreme cold. Pressurization systems failed, forcing crews to use emergency oxygen bottles. In the reality of sustained air combat, the B-17's high-altitude capability was often compromised by equipment failures and battle damage. Temperature was a critical factor affecting bombing accuracy, though one often overlooked in theoretical discussions. At 25,000 feet in winter, temperatures frequently reached 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. At such extreme cold, mechanical systems behaved unpredictably. Lubricants thickened, increasing friction and reducing the smoothness of mechanical motion. The differential gearing in the Norden's computer would bind if lubricants congealed. The gyroscope bearings would develop increased drag, reducing the stability of their spin. Metal contracted, potentially introducing mechanical misalignment that would degrade aiming accuracy. Bombardiers wore electrically heated suits powered by aircraft generators, but these systems frequently failed. Frostbite became endemic among crews flying multiple missions at altitude. Cases were documented where bombardiers were so severely frostbitten that their hands lost dexterity, impairing their ability to operate the Norden's controls with the fine motor control that accurate bombing demanded. More subtle was the degradation of decision-making capability that accompanied mild hypoxia and cold exposure. Bombardiers might fail to notice that the Norden's gyroscope had precessed slightly, introducing unknown aiming errors. They might underestimate wind velocity because their judgment was impaired by hypoxia and cold. The ballistic effects of altitude were mathematically complex. A 500-pound bomb released at 25,000 feet would fall approximately 30 seconds before impact. During that descent, the bomb would traverse layers of atmosphere with progressively higher density. Wind at altitude differed significantly from wind at ground level. A bomber at 25,000 feet might encounter a strong westerly wind, while the lower troposphere was calm or even showed wind from a different direction. These wind shears meant that the bomb's trajectory during its descent was not a simple parabola, but a complex curve affected by changing wind vectors at different altitudes. The Norden computed wind compensation based on inputs from the bombardier. The bombardier, using radar or visual observation, would estimate wind at the bombing altitude, but that wind might differ significantly from the actual wind the bomb would encounter during descent. Moreover, thermal effects could alter wind patterns unpredictably. Thermals rising from areas of dark ground could deflect falling bombs laterally. Inversions could create calm layers adjacent to high wind layers. The mechanics of the Norden could not account for these meteorological variations because they were inherently unpredictable. Atmospheric density variations also affected bomb ballistics. At extreme altitude, the thin air provided little aerodynamic braking. A bomb could travel further horizontally before falling to ground level, meaning that the release point had to be further back from the target than at lower altitudes. But the Norden's calculations assumed standard atmospheres at stated altitudes. Deviations from those standards, unusual temperature inversions, jet streams, atmospheric anomalies, could introduce errors that the bombardier could neither predict nor correct. German flak defense was predicated on understanding these ballistic principles. Flak crews could observe the altitude of bombing formations and calculate approximately where bombs would land based on aircraft ground speed and wind drift. The calculation was not perfect, but it was often close enough that bombing patterns were shifted away from the estimated impact points. Experienced German flak commanders learned to recognize the approach patterns of different bomb groups and could often predict, with surprising accuracy, where their bombs would fall. The relationship between altitude and bombing accuracy was therefore paradoxical. Higher altitude provided greater immunity from flak, but degraded bombing accuracy due to extended fall time, wind shear effects, and physical stresses on bombardiers and equipment. Lower altitude improved accuracy, but exposed bombers to more intense flak and fighter opposition. The American choice to bomb from 25,000 feet represented a strategic decision that safety from ground fire was worth the sacrifice in accuracy. This decision validated German assertions that American precision bombing doctrine was more theory than practice. Yet despite the degradation in accuracy at high altitude, American strategic bombing remained devastatingly effective. The reason was that accuracy was measured differently than German planners anticipated. The Norden was designed to achieve precision, a circular error probable of 100 feet at bombing altitude. But in practice, American planners did not require each individual bomb to hit the exact aim point. Instead, they accepted widely dispersed bombing patterns that would spread damage across an area. If a factory was a 200 by 300-foot building, and bombs fell in a pattern with circular error probable of 100 feet at altitude, Then approximately half of the bombs would fall within 100 feet of the aim point, enough to cause significant damage to the building. The German failure to appreciate this distinction, the difference between precision as engineering specification and precision as tactical concept, limited their ability to develop effective countermeasures. They attempted to disrupt the Norden through capture and examination, but they did not attempt to replicate its technical sophistication, having concluded in 1938 that their own simpler bomb sights were adequate. By the time the reality of American bombing campaigns became apparent, that dozens or hundreds of bombs could devastate large industrial targets despite individual bomb accuracy being measured in hundreds of feet, German industrial capacity to develop and produce countermeasures had already been crippled by those same bombing campaigns. The morning of August 17, 1943, dawned clear over England, the first such morning in a week of weather delays and postponed missions. At bases across East Anglia, the order to launch the maximum effort had been transmitted during the pre-dawn hours. Ground crews had worked through the night loading bombs and ammunition, fueling aircraft, performing pre-flight checks. By 7 in the morning, the first bombers were beginning their takeoff rolls. Not dozens of bombers, but hundreds. American strategic bombing doctrine, proved viable at Rouen exactly 1 year earlier, was now being tested at scale. The target was Schweinfurt, a medieval town in northern Bavaria, significant to the German war effort not for its intrinsic military importance, but for the precision ball-bearing factories located there. Ball bearings were essential components in virtually every machine tool, engine, and mechanical system. The theory was that by destroying the ball-bearing production capacity at Schweinfurt and the sister facility at Regensburg, American bombers could reduce Germany's ability to manufacture weapons. It was the first truly deep penetration into German airspace, well beyond the range of fighter escort, which had to turn back at the German border. The 8th Air Force dispatched 246 B-17s on the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. One force of 127 bombers would strike Schweinfurt, while a second force of 108 would attack Regensburg. The bombers were arranged in combat boxes, coordinated formations designed to maximize defensive firepower while maintaining sufficient cohesion for the lead bombardier's drop to be followed by all trailing aircraft in the formation. Each combat box was separated from adjacent combat boxes by hundreds of meters, creating layered defensive positions against fighter attack. Navigation to the target in the pre-radar era relied on visual confirmation of landmarks, mathematical dead reckoning corrected for winds, and the expertise of navigators who had studied maps for weeks before the mission. The lead navigator in each bomb group bore the responsibility for bringing dozens of bombers over the target at precisely the moment planned, within a window of 1 or 2 minutes that would allow all forces to strike nearly simultaneously, maximizing confusion among German defenses. The fighters that accompanied the bombers as far as the German border, American P-47 Thunderbolts equipped with auxiliary fuel tanks that extended their range, provided crucial cover during the first phase of the mission. But once the P-47s turned back, the bombers were on their own. German fighters, free now from the threat of American escort, converged on the bomber streams from all directions. The Luftwaffe had been alerted to the mission and had scrambled every available fighter squadron. For the bombardiers looking down through their Nordens at the German countryside, the mission represented the culmination of months of training and years of doctrine development. The lead bombardiers in each bomb group would use their Nordens to acquire the target cities from miles away, track them as the formation approached, and calculate release points. The trailing bombardiers would watch for the lead's ordnance drop and release their bombs in rapid sequence, creating a rolling wave of explosions across the target. The lead bombardier of the 99th Bomb Group, flying in a B-17 named Mascot, was among the first to acquire the target visually from 30,000 feet. The Schweinfurt industrial area was clearly visible through the Norden's telescope. The bombardier began the process of setting up for the run, inputting altitude, airspeed, and wind estimates. He manipulated the rate motor to keep the target stationary in his field of view as the aircraft approached. But before he could even reach the critical release point, the first waves of German fighters hit. Messerschmitt Bf-109s came from above and behind, their approach masked by the sun. Focke-Wulf Fw-190s attacked from the front, cannons blazing. B-17 gunners returned fire, tracers crisscrossing the sky, shells filling the aircraft. The concussion from nearby flak bursts shook the formations. In that chaos, some bombardiers maintained their focus, continuing to track their targets and execute their runs. Others, overwhelmed by the violence and distracted by the immediate threat to their lives, were forced to abandon careful aiming and release their bombs based on rough estimates or timing calculations. By the end of the day, casualties had been staggering. 22 B-17s were shot down over the target or on the return route. Many more were damaged so severely that they had to be scrapped upon return to England. 97 bombers had been lost during the two missions when losses from both Schweinfurt and Regensburg were combined, along with additional bombers that crashed in England or were abandoned over the Channel. Nearly 20% of the force had been destroyed in a single day. German fighter pilots, despite their losses, considered the day a victory. They had demonstrated that unescorted bombers operating deep in German airspace were terribly vulnerable. The 8th Air Force had attempted to maintain that bomber formations, with their dense defensive armament, could hold their own against fighter opposition without fighter escort. The results of Schweinfurt suggested otherwise. Yet despite the terrible losses, the bombing had achieved significant results against the target. Reconnaissance photographs taken after the raid showed extensive damage to the ball-bearing factories. The 8th Air Force commanders assessed that they had reduced German ball-bearing production by approximately 35%. More importantly, for doctrine purposes, the bombing had been delivered with acceptable accuracy. The majority of bombs had fallen within the industrial complex rather than on surrounding residential areas. American precision bombing had worked, even if it had worked at an unsustainable cost in terms of bomber losses. The immediate strategic response was not to continue operations at this level of attrition. The 8th Air Force suspended bombing operations deeper into Germany until they could acquire long-range fighters capable of escorting bombers all the way to deep targets and back. This recognition, that fighter escort was essential, not optional, represented a significant shift in doctrine. It meant accepting that precision bombing from high altitude was not by itself sufficient. Bombers needed protection from fighters, and that protection required not just escort fighters, but long-range escort fighters that could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back if necessary. The statistics of the strategic bombing campaign revealed an uncomfortable truth that aviation planners had not fully anticipated. Accuracy, as measured by distance of bomb fall from the aim point, did not correlate precisely with target damage. In 1943, analysis of bombing photographs showed that American bombardiers achieved an average circular error probable of 1,200 feet at altitude. This meant that only 16% of all bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the designated aim point. For targets defended by flak and fighters, accuracy degraded further. On missions where bombing had to be executed through 3/10 cloud cover or more, average accuracy fell to circular error probable of 2,500 feet or worse. These numbers would have been devastating to American strategic bombing doctrine had they been widely publicized. The myth of the Norden Bombsight's accuracy, the assumption that American bombardiers could drop ordnance into pickle barrels, depended on theoretical performance under ideal conditions. Combat conditions were rarely ideal, weather degraded accuracy. Enemy opposition broke up formations and forced evasive maneuvers. Equipment failures and human fatigue accumulated across the length of long missions. Yet the bombing was effective nonetheless. How? The answer lay in applying statistics at scale. If half of 1,000 bombs fell within a general area of the target, 500 bombs might damage the target severely even if none achieved the theoretical precision that the Norden's design permitted. A factory building might be destroyed by a nearby miss if the shock waves and fragmentation from the explosion were sufficient. A rail yard might be disrupted by bombs landing anywhere within the yard's boundaries, not just on the precise aim point. Historians and post-war analysts spent decades debating the actual effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign, with widely divergent conclusions. Some emphasized the industrial damage inflicted, pointing to documented reductions in German aircraft production, fuel production, and ball bearing manufacturing. Others emphasized the limitations, noting that despite massive bombing, German production recovered faster than had been anticipated, and that bombing did not achieve the degree of paralysis that its advocates had promised. The truth lay somewhere between these positions. Strategic bombing did inflict significant damage on German industrial capacity, but the damage was not as comprehensive or decisive as the Norden's theoretical accuracy suggested it could be. The gap between theoretical precision and combat performance was fundamental. The bombardier operating the Norden faced conditions that the device's design did not anticipate. Flak exploding around him, fighters attacking his aircraft, formation pressure demanding coordinated bombing regardless of the accuracy of his tracking, and the simple fact that long-distance bombing from high altitude to small targets, even with a mechanical computer, was inherently inaccurate at scale. German air defenses, meanwhile, inflicted a cost on American bombing that the strategic planners had not fully anticipated. The losses at Schweinfurt and the subsequent operations showed that unescorted bomber formations, despite their defensive armament, could not sustain operations against determined fighter opposition without unacceptable attrition. The 8th Air Force was forced to suspend deep bombing until fighter escort could be provided. This pause in operations gave Germany time to repair damage and increase production capacity, partially negating the effects of the bombing. The fundamental reality was that neither German attempts to develop tactics to counter American bombing, nor American attempts to perfect the precision of bombing doctrine, could overcome the industrial mathematics of the war. Germany could not produce fighters fast enough to replace those lost to American air operations. America could not build long-range fighter escorts fast enough to keep losses sustainable. American industry could produce bombers and bombs far faster than Germany could replace aircraft and rebuild destroyed factories. The Norden Bombsight embodied this larger truth. It was precisely what American engineers claimed it was, a sophisticated device capable of high accuracy under optimal conditions. But it was not, and could never be, the substitute for overwhelming industrial capacity and production advantage that some advocates had imagined. The bomber mafia believed that strategic air power operating above the reach of ground defenses could win wars through precision, economy of force, and the vulnerability of industrial systems to carefully targeted destruction. The German engineers who examined captured Nordens understood perfectly that American technical sophistication could not overcome the fundamental asymmetry of industrial capacity. Germany could not match American production, could not train replacement pilots and bombardiers as quickly as Americans could, and could not sustain indefinite air combat against an enemy with 4 times the industrial capacity. The irony was that German knowledge of the Norden sophistication actually demonstrated the limitations of that sophistication. If the most advanced American bombsight could only achieve 1,200 feet average SEP in combat, and if formation bombing negated even that precision in many cases, then Germany's own simpler bombsights were adequate for their strategic needs. The gap between American theoretical performance and combat reality was the space in which German air defenses could operate. But that space was shrinking as American long-range fighter escorts arrived, as American bomber crews gained experience, and as sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed German defensive capacity. German air defense strategy evolved throughout the bombing campaign, driven by the necessity of countering American bombers operating at altitudes where most conventional flak was ineffective. The 88mm gun provided the primary anti-aircraft defense against high-altitude bombers, but it required precise targeting information. Early in the campaign, German flak crews had to rely on visual acquisition and manual tracking. The arrival of Wurzburg radar systems in 1942 and their subsequent improvements provided the fire control solution that dramatically improved flak effectiveness. The Wurzburg radar could track aircraft altitudes, positions, and velocities with surprising accuracy. Combined with the computational abilities of Kommandodret fire control systems, the radar made possible accurate predictions of where bombers would be at the moment of flak detonation. The result was a quantum leap in anti-aircraft effectiveness. American bomber crews reported that accurate flak over defended targets suddenly appeared with little warning, as if the flak batteries possessed supernatural ability to predict bomber movements and altitudes. The German fighter arm, the Jagdwaffe, adapted its tactics to exploit American operational procedures. Early attempts to attack bomber formations head-on proved costly, as the concentrated defensive armament of formations was formidable. German fighters consequently developed attacking approaches from the side and rear, making use of formation gaps where defensive fire was less concentrated. Rammer attacks, ramming American bombers with fighters, appeared occasionally, usually as desperation tactics when aircraft were damaged or pilots were fanatically committed. The most effective innovation was the development of the Sturmbach formation. German pilots would attack in a carefully coordinated formation, exploiting gaps and weaknesses in American bomber formations. Rather than individual fighters making separate runs, squadrons of fighters would attack en masse, concentrating fire on the most vulnerable bombers. This tactic required significant skill and discipline, but could devastate a bomber formation in minutes. German pilots also learned that the most critical moments for attack were during the bomb run and during the formation's turn away from the target. During the bomb run, bomber formations had to maintain level flight to allow the bombardier to track and aim, eliminating evasive maneuvers that could break up fighter attacks. During the turn away from the target, the formation often became ragged and scattered as pilots reacted to the turn command at slightly different times, creating gaps that fighters could exploit. The Luftwaffe also attempted to defend using a strategy of attrition. They reasoned that if they could maintain losses at a level that American bomber production could not replace, the strategic bombing campaign would eventually become unsustainable. This strategy had merit in theory, but it ran into practical problems. American aircraft production exceeded German fighter production by such a margin that the Luftwaffe could inflict attrition rates that the 8th Air Force could sustain. But that would have been catastrophic for Germany if applied to any other branch of the military. More sophisticated German responses focused on understanding American bombing patterns and tactics. German intelligence agencies analyzed bomb damage photographs, interview reports from captured American airmen, and reconnaissance missions flown by German aircraft to understand American operational procedures. They determined that the Norden's reliance on visual target acquisition made weather a significant limiting factor. On days with cloud cover obscuring targets, bombing accuracy deteriorated dramatically. This insight led to German attempts to create artificial weather over targets. Smokescreen operations, where chemical fog generators created obscuring clouds, were employed over some heavily defended targets. The effect was not to eliminate bombing entirely, but to degrade accuracy sufficiently that collateral damage was reduced and civilian areas received more of the bombing load, possibly hoping to break German morale. The smokescreen strategy had limited success, however, and consumed resources that Germany increasingly could not spare. By 1944, German intelligence possessed comprehensive knowledge of American strategic bombing capabilities, limitations, tactics, and doctrine. They understood precisely how the Norden bombsight operated, what its accuracy potential was, and what factors degraded its performance. They had examined captured examples, studied technical drawings, interviewed captured bombardiers, and analyzed bombing results photographically. No nation in history had ever possessed better intelligence on an enemy's weapons system than Germany had on the Norden bombsight. Yet this knowledge translated into no meaningful German countermeasure, because, by the time this comprehensive understanding was achieved, the German situation had become hopeless. The problem was industrial capacity. Germany could not produce enough fighters to replace losses inflicted by American bombers and their fighter escorts. German pilot training had deteriorated dramatically as experienced pilots were lost, and replacements were hurried through training programs without adequate experience. German fuel production, damaged by bombing campaigns, constrained flight operations and limited pilot training. The Luftwaffe found itself in a downward spiral in which losses of experienced pilots and aircraft could not be replaced, forcing Germany to accept further losses to maintain a defensive air force. German defensive strategies that might have been effective in 1943, the smokescreen operations, the sophisticated fighter tactics, the improved flak coordination, could not be sustained as German resources dwindled. Fuel shortages meant that German fighters could not fly the intensive training needed to perfect their attack tactics. Industrial capacity needed to produce replacement aircraft was diverted to other military programs that seemed more critical. The Luftwaffe's share of German industrial capacity shrank as the Army and Navy competed for resources to support the deteriorating situation on the ground in Europe and at sea. The real secret of American success was not the Norden bombsight. It was industrial capacity. America could produce bombers, fighters, engines, ammunition, and spare parts in quantities that Germany could observe but not match. American industrial output was so vast that even inefficient bombing with accuracy measured in hundreds of feet instead of tens of feet, was devastatingly effective because the sheer tonnage dropped compensated for imprecision. American industries could replace losses of aircraft faster than Germany could replace aircraft shot down by American bombers. American training programs could produce qualified pilots and bombardiers faster than Germany could lose experienced aviators. The psychological impact of the bombing was also significant, though in ways that the precision bombing advocates had not fully anticipated. The bombing did not break German morale in the way some theorists had predicted. Civilian populations, while undoubtedly suffering, did not rise up against the Nazi government as some planning documents had suggested they would. But the cumulative effect of repeated bombing, of living under the threat of destruction from the air, of being forced to spend enormous resources on air defense that could have been used for weapons production, did exact a cost on German military capacity that was difficult to quantify but undeniable in aggregate effect. By the end of the war, the Norden bombsight had become not the decisive weapon that its advocates imagined, but rather a symbol of a broader strategic approach. Precision bombing from high altitude, conducted in daylight by formations of heavily armed bombers, had become the dominant American strategic bombing doctrine. It had forced Germany to devote enormous resources to air defense. It had damaged German industrial production, but it had not, by itself, won the war. That victory required the combined effort of American strategic bombing, Soviet military operations on the ground, British night bombing operations, naval blockade, and finally, the invasion of France and subsequent ground campaign into Germany. German knowledge of the Norden's capabilities had been useless because the real contest was not about bomb sight accuracy or bombing technique. It was about industrial capacity, about production rates, about the ability to sustain losses and continue fighting. Germany lost that contest decisively, not because the Luftwaffe did not understand American weapons, but because German industry could not produce replacements for losses at anything approaching American production rates. Hermann Lang, the spy who had stolen the Norden secrets in 1938, had delivered to Germany the technical specifications for what his contemporaries believed was a weapon of strategic consequence. German engineers had studied those specifications and concluded they represented sophisticated but not revolutionary technology. That assessment had proven correct, but correctness of technical judgment could not overcome the fundamental industrial mathematics of modern warfare. Germany could not copy the Norden fast enough even if they had decided to do so. Germany could not produce enough fighters to defend against the bombers carrying Nordens. Germany could not recover quickly enough from bombing damage to prevent cumulative degradation of industrial capacity. The legacy of the Norden bombsight and the German examination of it was a lesson in the complexity of technological warfare. Technical superiority, even comprehensive understanding of enemy technology, could not by itself determine victory. What mattered was industrial capacity, the ability to sustain operations over time, the capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting. The Norden was a magnificent achievement of precision engineering, but precision alone could not win wars. Only the combination of technical sophistication, industrial capacity, trained personnel, and strategic vision could do that. Germany possessed technical sophistication and strategic vision. They possessed trained personnel, though increasingly depleted. But they could not match American industrial capacity, and that deficiency ultimately determined the outcome of the bombing campaign and of the war itself. When the war ended, and American and Soviet forces entered the territories that had housed German research and manufacturing facilities, they discovered the remnants of German air defense efforts, the archived intelligence reports on American bombing, and the technological achievements that German industry had managed despite the constraints of war. Among these discoveries were German documents analyzing the Norden bombsight, technical reports comparing it to German designs, and assessments of its capabilities and limitations. These documents would be read by post-war American intelligence analysts with interest tinged by vindication. Germany had recognized American technical superiority but lacked the industrial means to match it. The Norden bombsight was indeed sophisticated, but its sophistication had been irrelevant to the outcome of the war. What mattered was not how well a bomb could be aimed, but how many bombs could be dropped, how many aircraft could be produced, and how many trained crews could be fielded. In those categories, Germany never possessed competitive capability against the United States, regardless of technical knowledge or sophisticated countermeasures. As the bombs fell from 25,000 feet, trailing their parachutes in the cold stratosphere, they were not guided by any magic precision that German study of the Norden had revealed. The bombs were guided by physics, by the calculations made by mechanical computers spinning with gyroscopes and differential gears, by the judgments of young men who had learned to operate complex equipment under conditions of unimaginable stress. Some bombs hit their targets with devastating accuracy. Many others fell hundreds of feet away, the victims of wind, temperature gradients, equipment failures, and human error. The Norden bombsight was sophisticated enough to enable strategic bombing campaigns that would damage German industrial capacity. It was not sophisticated enough to revolutionize warfare or render other military forces obsolete, as some of its more enthusiastic advocates had imagined. The German engineers who examined the Norden and provided their assessments to Luftwaffe leadership in 1938 had been correct in their technical judgments. The American bombsight was sophisticated, but it was not superior enough to justify German industry completely reorienting toward its production. The German choice to continue developing their own simpler bombsights was strategically sound given the knowledge available at the time. But it was also a choice made in a world before American strategic bombing became a daily reality, a choice made before the full implications of American industrial capacity became apparent. By 1943, when the full weight of the American strategic bombing campaign descended on the Reich, the nature of the contest had become clear. It was not a contest between bomb sites or bombing techniques, or even between air forces. It was a contest between industrial systems, between nations' abilities to sustain warfare, between competing models of how technological sophistication could be brought to bear on military problems. Germany had technological sophistication but limited industrial capacity. The United States had both, and could afford to build bombers carrying sophisticated bomb sights by the thousands, train bombardiers by the tens of thousands, and replace aircraft and crews as they were lost without reaching any point of unsustainability. The true secret was not in the Norden Bombsight's mechanisms, or in the depths to which German intelligence could penetrate its design. The true secret was that American industrial capacity could support a strategic bombing campaign of such scale and intensity that even bombing with accuracy measured in hundreds of feet could destroy a nation's ability to wage war. Knowledge of American capabilities could not help Germany overcome the fundamental disparity in productive capacity. Understanding the Norden was interesting intellectually but strategically irrelevant in the face of 2,000 American bombers appearing over Germany on a clear day, each carrying a bomb sight, each carrying tons of ordnance, each part of a system that could be repeated day after day, with replacements manufactured in American factories that could not be destroyed by German counterattacks. The story of the Norden Bombsight, from its development through American hands to its examination by German engineers, and finally to its employment in one of history's most intensive bombing campaigns, is ultimately a story about the relationship between technology and industrial capacity, between knowing how something works and being able to counter it effectively. Germany had knowledge. They did not have the industrial capacity to translate that knowledge into effective countermeasures. By the time they understood what they faced, the weight of American industrial production had become too great to overcome. The bombardiers flying B-17s from 25,000 feet, peering through their Norden bomb sights at targets miles below, never knew that their instrument secrets had been stolen years before they were born, that German engineers had studied the designs and chosen not to copy them, that the knowledge of American technical sophistication had been available to German planners, but had proven useless in the face of overwhelming material disadvantage. They knew only that their bombardier's oath demanded that they destroy the bomb sites if their aircraft was shot down, that they carried with them a device American propaganda claimed could drop bombs into pickle barrels, that their bombing campaign was part of a larger strategy to win a war by destroying the enemy's industrial capacity. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more untold accounts of courage, tragedy, and survival from the war that shaped our world.